If you're afraid of the dentist, know that you are not alone. Studies have pegged the number of people in the US alone that suffer from some level of dentophobia at anywhere from 36 to 60% of the population. And while the majority of those fears, of course, do come from the anxiety and dread one feels about what happens while sitting in a dentist chair, one can't help but wonder if perhaps those fears would only be made worse if the sufferer also knew about the connection between that chair, dentistry, and, well, another frightening chair. Because it's a well-documented, but not always widely known fact that it was a dentist responsible for inventing one of the most infamous, deadliest devices in the history of law enforcement and justice, the electric chair. The origins of the electric chair can actually be traced back to the early 1880s, when the spread of arc lighting outdoor street lamps tragically led to a distressingly high number of electric linemen being fatally electrocuted while working on the system. People certainly already knew that electricity in general could be dangerous, but for the first time, people were beginning to study how and why sudden, large dosages of voltage could stop a person's heart. One such coroner was tasked, in Buffalo, New York in 1881, to investigate the case of a drunken dock worker who had died while grabbing a large electric dynamo, in an attempt to recreate the pleasant tingling sensation he had experienced while briefly touching a guardrail in an arc lighting powerhouse. The coroner presented his findings on the case to an audience at a local Buffalo Scientific Society. One of those in attendance was a dentist with a technical background named Alfred P. Southwick, who walked away convinced this information could have some sort of more practical application. Teaming with a local physician and, surprisingly, the Buffalo ASPCA, Southwick proceeded to conduct hundreds of experiments involving electrocuting stray dogs. Ultimately, after finding a preferred and easily repeatable method to euthanize the animals using electricity, Southwick published his ideas in scientific journals in 1882 and 1883, advocating the notion that this method could eventually be used as a more humane alternative to hanging in capital punishment cases. Eager to prove his idea, Southwick put in the work himself, modifying a dentist chair with several restraints and creating the first electric chair. Following a number of botched hangings in the U.S. in the late 1880s, mounting criticism of the death penalty led New York to form a commission looking for more humane methods of execution. Southwick's electric chair was eventually chosen as this new method, and on August 6, 1890, William Kemmler, a New York man who had murdered his wife with a hatchet, was the first criminal to be put to death in this manner. Over the next few decades, the electric chair was adopted by more and more states with capital punishment, surpassing hanging as the most common execution manner, just as Southwick had predicted. Some states called it Old Sparky, others Old Smoky. Whatever it was called, it soon became the ultimate American symbol of the death penalty. But it was not without its own controversies, even beyond the overall general debate regarding capital punishment in the first place. After a few notable instances of its own botched executions, with some inmates painfully surviving their burst of electricity or even having their head catch on fire during the process, the supposedly more humane nature of the electric chair was called into question. The 1979 advent of lethal injection saw the beginning of the decline of the electric chair as the default execution method in most states. Today, in 2022, only 5 states still offer the electric chair as a potential method, and only when the inmate chooses it instead of lethal injection. Perhaps needless to say, this does not happen often. But even as the electric chair fades into a relic of times past, its intimidating visage and frightening, deadly legacy ensure it will be an immortal, dark curiosity of American history. Its usage has certainly been featured in a number of novels, TV shows, and films, suggesting an ongoing public fascination with this instrument of death. And in the late 80s, when one of cinema's masters of horror decided it was time to outdo the creation of his previous iconic genre villain, Freddy Krueger, he theorized the electric chair might just be the right exciting visual and thematic device to send his new villain onto his supernatural journey. The year is 1989, and Universal Pictures are ready to launch the next big horror slasher franchise with Shocker. welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
And I'm Chris. So let's cut the foreplay and get deep inside the mind of serial killer Horace, 2 in the pinker, 1 in the stinker.
Nice. Yeah. You told me earlier you were very proud of your opener, and I can see why. So, Chris, sometimes things just work out. Right? Sometimes like the stars align, the pieces fall into place. And you and I, a while back, decided to do this 3-month epic series, Fall Back to the 80s. Mm-hmm. And we were going chronologically, right? We're doing like films from the 80s, like in chronological order. And then it just so happens that this last episode of Fall Back to the 80s, the last installment, fell into October, which is my favorite time of the year. Yep. For a very particular reason, and that is, of course, my favorite holiday, the spookiest time of the year, Halloween season. And so I was kind of really hoping that we could find a horror film that would because I like doing horror films for Halloween season. And lo and behold, in 1989, there was a failed horror franchise starter, and at least in like the circles I roll in, a quite infamous one that I was actually pretty excited to talk about. Mm-hmm. So today, for our big finale to Fall Back to the 80s, we are looking at 1989's Shocker. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about this one?
For sure. This is written and directed by one of the masters of horror, Wes Craven. He made Elm Street, Scream, Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left. This movie's budget was $10 million, and worldwide it went on to make $16.5 million, so it did not do well. No. That's probably the biggest reason why we did not get another one.
Although, and I didn't look into, I wonder what this was like on video, because for me, this came out when I was, 9 or 10, and I definitely remember this being a pretty perennial, like, video shelf, like, I think one of the most famous things about this movie is the poster. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that poster is, like, super iconic, and just remember seeing that VHS all the time at the video store. And it just seems like a movie that maybe did pretty well on video, but obviously not enough to make it into a franchise, as they were hoping. And we'll talk a little bit more about those franchise hopes, obviously, and everything. But I think a good place to start, you mentioned the fact that it's not very often. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's not true. I don't know. I don't have the backup for this, so I'm just talking out of my butt here. I was going to say, it's not too often we do failed franchise starters from kind of undisputed masters of their genre, right? Yeah. But this is a big one. This is Wes Craven. So when there's a failure from Wes Craven, well, on the surface it seems surprising. Actually, if you start to look at his filmography, it's kind of hit and miss a little bit there. Right. But the hits are very, very big, right? So you already mentioned, what some of the films he's most known for. But obviously I just wanted to start, and I'll talk about how I feel in a moment. But your just general thoughts on Wes Craven, the late, great Wes Craven, as a filmmaker, and in particular as a horror kind of maestro.
Yeah, I'm obviously a fan. You are the horror aficionado of the two of us. Me gaining traction as the years go by, I think. Every year I usually ask Trev for a list of movies to watch in October, and typically I get through all of them, which is nice. But Wes Craven was one of the best. The Scream films are, up and down, but an undisputable, iconic franchise. The most recent one we just got, but obviously not from him, but it was very, very good. And then Freddy Krueger, I mean, what else can you say about him? One of the most iconic horror monsters in the genre. Just an incredible look, an incredible design. Came from his childhood, right? If I remember correctly, yes. We did the Elm Street reboot in a previous episode, so go check that one out. But I think we go over that it came from Wes Craven's like childhood of like seeing somebody out the window or something.
Yep. Yeah, just a kind of a transient who was walking by the window and stared up at him and then wouldn't leave.
What's cool about Wes Craven's career is that he's made so many great things that they have been rebooted or remade. Just looking around here, like Hills Have Eyes, that has been rebooted to make their own successful franchise. Last House on the Left did the same thing, and then Elm Street didn't, and that's why we talked about it. But he has a specific look to his films. He incorporates dreamscapes. He's definitely fascinated with that world. So yeah, Wes Craven, obviously a fan, like of course.
Well, and we've talked about this before, but obviously, in a previous episode, so we'll just reiterate some of it. But the other great thing about Craven is that he was really thoughtful about the horror genre. and about filmmaking in general. This is not just some guy who got into horror just because it was like the easy thing to do, and because it was, he was like, oh, I'll just make a cheap exploitation film. Obviously, he did that to a certain degree, but you have to remember that he also taught English at Westminster College. He was a humanities professor at the Clarkson College of Technology. He was very, very interested in the philosophy of horror and kind of the deeper meanings behind it. While he was alive, Wes Craven was always one of my favorite filmmakers to watch be interviewed about the horror genre. If you were making a documentary about horror and you didn't have Wes Craven in it, you were doing yourself a disservice, because he just, whatever he had to say about it, his films and others, it was always just the most intelligent, kind of thought-provoking commentary. Because he had degrees in English and psychology, and then master's degrees in philosophy and writing. So he was very, very, when you talk about like the dreamscape and everything, he thought deeply about, even with Freddy Krueger, we talked about how he made the colors of the sweater, the two colors that he researched that said are the most like kind of hard for the eye to look at together. He's always thinking about these deeper things, which is interesting because he was also, I don't know if you know this, Chris, maybe we talked about it last time, he was also a porn director when he was younger.
I didn't know.
Which is actually kind of common for a lot of the filmmakers of that time. That was obviously in the 60s and in particular the 70s was the initial like kind of porn and adult film explosion. And if you were a filmmaker like working in New York, there was a lot of easy jobs to get if in the adult film industry. And he directed quite a few porn films as well under his pseudonym, but then obviously jumped into horror films. And this has kind of often been repeated about him, so this is not like an original thought from me. But I think the most impressive thing about Wes Craven is that people will say, if you're a filmmaker, you're pretty blessed if you can have one kind of genre-defining film for the decade. A movie that comes along and for that decade, like either defines the decade or kind of reinvents the rules of the decade or just really makes this gigantic splash and changes direction of horror. And he did that 3 times, 3 decades in a row. Yeah. 1972 with Last House on the Left, that movie was such a shock to the system, just so infamous and like hard for people to deal with. It kind of like instantly makes his name. Then like we said, in the 80s, as the slasher boom is kind of dying off and kind of getting very repetitive and people don't know where to go with it, in 1984 he delivers A Nightmare on Elm Street and completely reinvents what the slasher can do by putting this kind of bigger supernatural, big concept sheen over it. And then I think after that, he goes into this run where his star kind of falls a little bit, right? He's not, his films aren't kind of connecting as much, and I think a lot of people had written him off. And then he comes roaring back near the the end of the 90s in 1996 with Scream and does it again, right? Kind of brings the slasher back and like basically creates a whole new wave of slashers that are all so clearly Scream influenced. And yes, I know it's Kevin Williamson's script as well, but you can't dismiss how important it was for Craven to be the director of that. And so suddenly you have I Know What You Did Last Summer and, The Faculty and Valentine's Day and Urban Legends and all these movies that their posters look like the Scream poster, the dialogue, the cast they get. So yeah, 3 times he made the movie that you could say arguably is one of the most defining horror films of that decade.
Well, and I always thought it was fascinating because, when he comes back to the Elm Street franchise to do New Nightmare, and then goes on to the Scream films, there's that meta commentary, right? So he's not just doing another slasher film anymore. He has a new thing to say about the genre itself. And it's so funny to see imitators come along after Scream and just do slasher movies. And it's funny because Scream was haha, that's exactly what we were getting at. And it's almost like these filmmakers were unaware of what they were doing, or didn't even really understand what Scream was going for at a time, at least the execs didn't understand. You know what I mean?
And that happened each time too, right? With Last House on the Left, he comes this really kind of angry, dirty, disgusting, hard to watch movie, but still there's something there. It's his remake of an Ingmar Bergman film, The Virgin Spring. It's him taking that and making it into an exploitation film, but there's still something there under the surface. But what happens in the wake of it is everyone goes, oh, let's just make gross, nasty rape revenge movies, and let's have the rape scenes be as really long and really hard to watch, and they're kind of missing the point, right? Then Nightmare on Elm Street, that same thing happens. He comes and he says, hey, you guys have kind of really run the slasher genre into the ground. Well, look how creative you can actually get with it. Here's what you can do with it. But people take the wrong lessons from that too, right?
Yeah.
Even with the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, they take the wrong lessons. But then interestingly enough, we can also say, and this will be our nice segue into this film, at least once, Wes Craven maybe arguably kind of tried to replicate Nightmare on Elm Street with the wrong lessons, right? So he wasn't perfect. As I said, his filmography does have some questionable ones in there as well. It's not an entirely perfect filmography. But in general, I think if you had only made Last House on Left, you'd be a legend. If you had only made Nightmare on Elm Street, you'd be a legend. And if you had only made Scream, you'd be a legend. And he did all three. And then there's some other good ones in there as well. So hats off to him. Still miss him. His loss was a gigantic loss for the genre. And I think just for filmmaking in general, it's one of those things where, unfortunately, I feel like he really didn't start to get his due in an even larger way until after he passed, and people were finally talking about him as more than just a horror director,
right?
And how like what he brought to just filmmaking in general. But love Wes Craven. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind, people, that I do love Wes Craven as we talk about Shocker.
Okay, why does he make Shocker? Why does this happen? We keep saying Nightmare on Elm Street, Nightmare on Elm Street. Well, what? His name is synonymous with that franchise, but oddly enough, he's kind of pushed out of that franchise pretty quickly.
You say like it's pushed out, or just kind of like him. He just doesn't kind of care himself, right? He made the first one, and he never really had any interest in it as a franchise. But of course, where money is to be made, they go on without him, and you can kind of tell with the second film in particular.
Yeah.
You've seen them all, right, Chris?
I have. Yes, I have them. Yeah.
Yeah, that second one, they're not really following the rules he established in the first movie, right? They haven't really figured out
rules.
Freddy Krueger. Okay, we'll get to rules. Don't worry.
Okay.
And then he does come back. He's involved in the writing of part 3, which I would say is personally to me the best one.
Yeah.
And like he gets it back on track, and then he kind of pieces out again. He says, "Okay, I made there's my final statement on it." And then he watches as the franchise goes in this completely different direction, right? Of like really cranking up the humor of Freddy Krueger, and just kind of like, I don't want to say sanitizing it, but what am I trying to say?
I think that is the word. I think it does sanitize him. He was such a, again, when we were saying a horror icon, evil, disgusting child rapist and murderer or whatever, right? Like, I don't know about rapist. I think that's what they added into the reboot, right? That's what it was.
It's like it's heavily insinuated in the series, but I think it's not actually stated until Freddy's dead. Yeah, and then the reboot really ran with it.
Yeah. So basically, he's just a disgusting, disgusting monster in the genre. Played for laughs. And I think that never sat well with Wes. He didn't like that. And to be honest, even as a fan of the franchise in general too, you do have to kind of warp your mind a little bit while watching those later sequels. So yeah, I can understand why you see your creation just kind of go off the rails like that. So I can't begrudge him for that either. So.
Yeah. And he eventually, and like this is jumping ahead just a little bit, but we'll say it now so we don't have to come to it later. But you already alluded to this. When he finally comes back in 1994 with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, it's clear that it's his statement again about how he is dismayed about what happened to the franchise. And him saying, like, if I'm going to come back, I'm going to do something completely different with this. I have something to say again, and I'll make it a meta commentary on the franchise, on horror, and the way we treat these characters and like what they mean in a larger sense, right? So he's at least he gets his trilogy. That's the nice thing is to me,
Definitely.
The Nightmare on Elm Street trilogy is 1, 3, and New Nightmare. The Wes Craven trilogy is kind of all you need. I like a couple of the others on a camp level, but his 3 are definitely the best installments.
Enter in Alive Films.
Yes.
So Trev wanted to mention this too because Alive Films was the head of it is what Alice Cooper's talent manager.
Yes, so his name's Shep Gordon. So Shep Gordon was a talent manager, a film agent, and a producer. His life has actually been documented in a documentary that Mike Myers made in 2013 called Supermensch, The Legend of Shep Gordon, because apparently he's just like a very beloved figure. Like people who worked with him just loved this guy, right? And one of his primary things is he kind of got involved in the entertainment business by first being Alice Cooper's manager. And he goes on to manage a number of musical acts. I was looking at this. I'm not going to read them all, Chris, but I'm just going to throw out some of the acts he managed. He managed Blondie, Luther Vandross, Frankie Valli, George Clinton, Groucho Marx at one point.
Wow.
Kenny Loggins, Michelle Schacht, Pink Floyd, Raquel Welch, Rick James. So he went on to manage quite a lot of people in his time. But he also got involved in some other, like, entertainment ventures and even like culinary, entrepreneurship and things like this. He did some restaurants, ran some restaurants, did speaking engagements, but he ultimately got involved with film. And his first movie that he was a producer on was the directorial debut of Ridley Scott, The Duelists. Shep Gordon produced that. And obviously he had a good time working on it. He goes on to work on some other films. And so he ultimately ends up making Alive Films, which is one of like the first and kind of most prominent, like big independent kind of studios that would like partner with, larger studios. And so he creates Alive Films. And I only wanted to bring that up because there's at least one element of shocker when you realize it's coming from Shep Gordon and Alive Films that I think is probably his influence pretty heavily on it. But he's the one who kind of comes to Wes Craven and says, hey, horror is still, fairly hot here at the end of the 80s. The Nightmare on Elm Street series, we know you're not happy with where it's gone, but it's still making money, right? These sequels, these later Nightmare on Elm Street sequels are making money. What if you could kind of do your new version of that? And we'll give you kind of carte blanche, right? You have creative control. And so this very much is a movie, and I'm sure we have more to say about this, but everybody involved is pretty open about how this was a movie made to not only compete with Nightmare on Elm Street, but I believe Wes Craven even said this was kind of made to destroy Nightmare on Elm Street, right? He wanted to create like a better version of Freddy.
The name of our villain is Horace Pinker, and Horace Pinker is designed to retire Freddy Krueger.
Saving it.
So I was looking for a creation of a new character that would be just as exciting, more exciting than Freddy.
Again, Wes gets complete creative control, even more of a financial stake in this the movie and then potential franchise. And he incorporates a lot, and we'll get to this when we talk about the film, but he incorporates a lot of the stuff that his go-tos, right? Dreamscapes, certain powers over reality.
And I wanted to have him occupy a world that was similar to Freddy's dream world, that was just as powerful, just as pervasive, and just as familiar in its own strange way. Of course, it was television itself. Television is the daytime dreaming of our nation. So I thought, who is the Freddy Krueger of that state? So I invented Horace Pinker.
So he wanted to incorporate this character that can use the TV to their advantage or disadvantage, which we'll get to. Definitely, I don't want to bury the lead how I feel about the movie, right? But it's I don't want to say Freddy knockoff yet.
Well, it is interesting.
It's hard not to.
I think we can say this without getting into our thoughts.
Okay.
And I'll just say, when you watch the movie, especially if you keep in mind that Wes Craven was apparently upset with the direction of Nightmare on Elm Street, and that he was trying to make this as an answer to and like a better competitor to what Freddy'd become, that colors the movie in a strange way.
Yes.
Because when you watch the film, it's let's just say it, like, without again getting into quality, this actually feels like one of the later Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Like that's what gets strange about it. Like that's where you wonder, because like hearing that he had complete creative control, it is that kind of thing where you can't. It's hard to reconcile his disappointment with what Freddy became, but then what he created in like response to it.
Correct. Yes. I definitely want to add to that, but I'll wait. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. That's fine.
Okay.
Well, let's instead talk about the other major players then, because I think a lot of what we have to say about just the movie will come from the review.
Yeah, definitely.
But obviously, if you're going to make a Freddy competitor, you need to find your Freddy, and that's actually very, very important, right? Because that was one of the most crucial things about Nightmare on Elm Street, and what really set it apart from other horror series, is that you can kind of have an interchangeable number of stuntmen and performers play Jason and Michael Myers and Leatherface, right? That's been proven. Mm-hmm. But the key to Nightmare on Elm Street was the iconic, amazing performance of Robert Englund as Freddy. And that's a huge part of why that character became so indelible, so loved, and why people were willing to let that character become more of like a pop culture anti-hero, go on to be like a children's toy, and like host a TV show. That was like obviously a big, that had to do with Robert Englund. So Wes Craven wants to create a character that's going to, retire Freddy, then he needs to find a performer who can, stand toe-to-toe with Robert Englund. And, Robert Englund was a fairly, like, young, up-and-coming, somewhat no-name actor at the time, so it stands to reason you would do the same thing here. right? And so who they find is an actor that's known today in genre circles for a much larger role that would come later. But this would be, you have to say this is his breakthrough role, right? Well, I mean, as much as it did break him through.
Right.
But Mitch Pileggi, who, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he also plays later on, after surviving the experience of Shocker, he goes on to play Walter Skinner in the X-Files, the boss of Mulder and Scully. Chris, I don't know if we ever talked. Were you an X-Files fan growing up, or I mean, have you seen some of it, or what's your like? I guess I'm just asking in a roundabout way, Pileggi experience, but
yeah. Interestingly enough, the X-Files is a major blind spot for me.
Okay.
The only reason, honestly, is there's about 500 episodes.
Yeah, it ran for a long time. Yeah.
And like movies.
But there's at least 100 good ones.
Yeah. well, and that's the reason why. Like me and my friend will talk about this fairly regularly, being like, we should finally start the X-Files. And then you get to the episode count, and you're just like, I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
But obviously, I know it through film.
I mean,
right,
if you're willing to not be a completist, I would happily maybe tell you what crap to skip, because there's a lot of stuff you can skip.
Yeah, hey? Like with Next Generation?
Yeah, very similar
Very much
to
so.
that, yes.
Okay. Similar reasons why I haven't watched that show either. Yeah, but yeah, my I don't want to call you an uncultured American, but it's actually pronounced Pileggi. But that's all good. It's all good.
Okay,
It doesn't matter.
all
It's
right.
all good.
Thank you.
But no, my filmography for him is really, he's kind of a guy that shows up. You know,
Yep.
like right now I'm looking, he has 105 acting credits. He's always popping up and stuff. Always seems like, I watched an interview with him, and he was talking just how he always gets roles as the heavy, right? Or like the bad guy, just because of the way he looks. He's like, I keep in shape all the time, and he's got an intimidating presence, which again is kind of perfect for what they're going for in Horace Pinker in Shocker. So they look towards this guy, and I guess even Craven he knew he could act, but actually wrote him more dialogue as they filmed, because he was showing off that how good he was, right? How much scenery he could chew.
You know, and then as time went on, he realized that I was a pretty fair actor, and he wrote this when the scene where I get the electrocution scene. He wrote me this great speech right before they throw the switch, and he told me, he said, I realize you can do this, you can handle this dialogue. So he wrote me this great scene.
So this wasn't even the role he auditioned for initially, right?
Correct. Yeah, he actually auditioned for the coach of the main character. The main character's name is Jonathan, played by Peter Berg. Failure to franchise listeners will know that we did episodes on Hancock and what the hell's the other one we did? Battleship. Battleship. So Peter Berg obviously went on to be like a mega Hollywood director, but this is one of his first roles. But in the film, he plays a high school student. He's a football guy, and then his coach in the film. That's what Mitch Pileggi was going for. And then in the audition, Wes Craven realized, no, you are definitely more in line for the villain.
Yeah. And I think Pileggi had two things going for him then, right? Because like physically, like you said, he's intimidating, right? He's a scary guy.
Yes.
Or he can be a scary guy to look at, and you're like, okay, that's good for this character. But based on what you just said, it's fairly clear too, and this is important for what Craven's vision obviously was. Again, without talking about like how we feel about it or anything about his performance, it's safe to say even at this point, not an actor who is afraid to go over the top. to really go for it with this role, and obviously that's what they wanted, because they did want, if anything else, they wanted people to walk out of this movie really remembering Horace Pinker and thinking like, oh, that character was entertaining, I'd like to see more of him, so I think it was very important for him to be scary but also be funny and just crazy and ridiculous when the movie calls for it.
Yep. And then you got to get your final girl. Oh wait, we don't get the final girl, because we're changing it up a little bit. We're gonna get a final boy. And that is Peter Berg, as I just mentioned. So, like I just said.
I feel like it's a little forgotten today that Peter Berg was an actor first, and that's because his acting career never really took off. And, maybe we'll talk about why that might be later on. But definitely made more of an impact later on when he got into directing. Although I'm sure you saw this too, Chris, is that while they were making this movie, apparently Peter Berg was already kind of he was shadowing Craven a lot, asking him
Yeah.
a lot of questions. And at one point on the set, he even told Mitch Pileggi, someday I want to be a big Hollywood director. So he was already thinking about that. So I think he was one of those guys who maybe saw acting as a stepping stone to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess right before we go into actually talking about the film, do you want to mention the music right now?
Yeah, I think that's what I was alluding to earlier for the music. Not so much the score, but the soundtrack to this film,
Yeah.
which is a heavily, or almost entirely, I would say, just a heavy metal soundtrack. And I think that definitely is the Shep Gordon Alive films influence. Again, Shep Gordon having a lot of success as the manager of Alice Cooper. I believe he's one of the producers on John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness, and Alice Cooper has a small role in that movie, and that clearly explains that. But I would imagine, because nothing else in Craven's filmography or just his life seems to insinuate that he was probably a big metalhead. I don't think. He definitely, I think, was someone who probably kept abreast of what the trends were. But I bet dollars to donuts that Shep Gordon was the guy saying, "Hey, you know what? MTV is really big right now. Heavy metal is really big. I represent, some of these bands. I've seen the success of heavy metal. We should really populate this movie with heavy metal music, and then we can also get a soundtrack to go along with this." And I do remember the Shocker soundtrack. I don't want to call it a big deal, but I remember it being kind of touted as oh, if you're a metalhead, man, the Shocker soundtrack. That's it's just full of all these metal bands, and it's Shocker even has its own heavy metal theme song that plays over the end credits and everything. So that's why I brought up Shep Gordon. It just feels like that's definitely his influence more than Craven's.
Oh, for sure. I think I even read somewhere or heard it from a source in the research that was a disagreement. That I know Wes wanted more of a actually orchestral score. So
yeah.
I guess let's mention a couple of people. The movie's title song was recorded by the Dudes of Wrath. It's a super
Everyone
group.
remembers them, right?
Yeah, the Dudes of Wrath. A supergroup composed of Paul Stanley of Kiss and Desmond Child, both on vocals, Vivian Campbell and Guy Mandude on guitars, Whitesnake's Rudy Sarzo on bass guitar, Motley Crue, Tommy Lee on drums. Also some backing vocals by Van Halen bassist Michael Anthony and Kane Roberts. So I've been in a little bit of a hair metal kick the last couple of months, actually, just totally honest. So it was kind of cool when that theme comes on. I was like, oh yeah, okay, feels so.
Yeah, I mean, the music is, if you're into that era of heavy metal, the music, when it's not my favorite kind of rock music.
Sure. But
there's a certain there's a certain nostalgic charm to it, I'd say, as someone who even grew up during that time period. And we'll mention a couple other performers as we talk about the movie, but I think one I just want to quickly throw out here before we get into our review, because I feel like I'll forget, because he's not really crucial in the movie, but I do think it's interesting to at least a certain subset of people that there's a television evangelist in this movie, and he's played by Dr. Timothy Leary, which would probably mean nothing to most young people coming to this movie today, but would have been a very interesting cameo at the time. So Timothy Leary was in the 80s and 90s, or I would say 60s, especially 60s into 70s, a very, very famous figure because he was an American psychologist and an author who is kind of known as the most public advocate for taking psychedelic drugs. Oh. He really rose to fame as a huge counterculture icon. He was one of those guys who I knew about when I was a kid, just because he was often mentioned and parodied in things like Mad Magazine or on comedy shows. Right? He was still kind of floating around. Obviously, he was older now, but it was kind of that thing of when people talked about people who were into psychedelic drugs, there was always a Timothy Leary reference, oh, Timothy Leary would approve or something like that. Right? So I just thought it's interesting that probably speaks again to Craven's interest in psychology and things like that. And maybe even the effects of LSD and mind expansion through psychedelic drugs. But I think it's kind of interesting and fun that he put Timothy Leary into this movie in a small little cameo. So I just wanted to throw that in just in case I forgot to mention that later.
I thought you were going to mention Ted Raimi.
We'll get to Ted Raimi. Don't worry.
Okay. Let's get into it.
Sure, let's.
From Wes Craven.
Don't let him take your soul.
Come on! Director of the original Nightmare on Elm Street.
Come on, Ted.
Comes his most terrifying creation.
No more!
100,000 volts of pure evil. Shocker.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Rated R. starts Friday at a theater near you.
After being captured for committing a series of gruesome murders, Horace Pinker, a television repairman, faces execution by way of the electric chair. But a deal with the devil allows him to come back in the form of electricity. Once changed, Pinker targets foster child Jonathan Parker and anyone else that gets between them. However, Jonathan's mysterious connection to Pinker through the dreamscape might help track down the killer's next moves.
So that's ultimately that's a fairly good kind of plot synopsis that might be on the back of like a VHS box or something, for this movie. But I will say, and this happens occasionally, this will probably come up as we talk more about the movie, and I don't envy you, Chris, having to try and summarize this film. But that's definitely one of those plot synopses where I listen to it and I go, yeah, that is the movie, but at the same time, boy, there's so much that's not in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's probably something we'll talk about. But Chris, I'm gonna let you go first on this one because I can't wait to hear your like initial reaction to this film and just kind of how you think about it, and then I'll talk about like my history with the movie and what I felt this time.
Okay, so yeah, this was my first viewing of this. First of all, was this you've seen this before, right?
So that's the thing. I know that I rented this on VHS. Like I said, back in the day with that video cover. Didn't see it in the theater, but I know I rented it later on VHS. And yet, I rewatched it for the first time in decades for this show because I don't think I'd seen it since then. And I do have to say, watching this movie, which is about, a little over an hour and a half, so watching it with my girlfriend, and I kept saying to her, I don't remember any of this. Like, I think we were like 40 or so minutes into the movie before something happened that seemed fairly familiar to me. So this might as well have been a first-time watch. I definitely remembered and knew more than you did. And like little things would pop up and go, oh, yeah, this I remember. But in general, boy, I didn't realize how much this movie I had forgot and how much... how different it was both in concept and execution, no pun intended, than what I remembered of it.
There's a lot of movies in this movie, and that's, I think, where my biggest negative is going to be. So first off the bat, I will say I enjoyed this. I liked it up into a point, and then it becomes a totally different thing. I think halfway through, it is a with the dreamscape and what's Jonathan Parker's connection to Horace Pinker, even though it's fairly obvious. There's a twist on the final girl stuff in the beginning, which we'll talk about later. Horace Pinker looks interesting. He's a very psychotic. He's got some immediate iconography to him. But then the movie becomes a body swap movie, and I can understand why audiences didn't latch on to this, because the movie's overlong. You said just over an hour and a half. It's an hour and 51 minutes. So it's almost 2 hours, and you can feel it. It's very plot heavy. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it breaks the film's internal rules, I think, 50 times. So that's really frustrating. I enjoyed it. I like Peter Berg. I liked his girlfriend. I like Mitch Pileggi. But there's not enough Horace Pinker in the movie. And then it gets to this really outrageous, cartoony last 15 minutes, and it just feels like it's so inconsistent with everything we saw before, because again, the first half is like really brutal, and it's quite depressing, and it's quite sad. Like, the body count is gigantic. In the first 25 minutes, like, Horace has killed like 30 people, it feels like. A lot of it off screen, though, I will say that. I guess there was some issues with the rating. We didn't mention this before, but it got a pretty hard X rating, and they went back to the MPAA like 13 times to get it down to an R. But yeah, I like this movie. It sounds like I'm being really harsh on it right now because I think I'm just getting it out, but it's like I liked it to a point that it just becomes like a Freddy clone. And like Trev was getting at before, saying that like Wes Craven, talked about like, oh, I want creative control because I want to destroy Freddy. I want to just shit all over that franchise. And then he just goes and makes the Freddy movies again. And that's where I found it very strange, because the beginning of the movie feels right. It feels serious and dark and scary and gross and brutal, but then it becomes a later Freddy franchise entry. So it's kind of in conflict with itself. So I had an interesting time watching it because I knew I was enjoying it, but I totally understood why this did not connect. Do you know what I'm trying to get at? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I'm very aware of every single issue with the movie, and why audience were just like, let's just go back to Freddy.
So, as I said, I saw this when I was a kid, and then just never kind of thought about it again. I believe, and I've lived my entire life with this general conception, and it's this. I think this is kind of the, even today, for a large swath of the horror fandom, the kind of general consensus is this is a bad movie, right? This is a bad attempt to recreate Nightmare on Elm Street, and there's nothing there. And like the people who are into it often seem to me like are maybe into it ironically.
Sure.
So I just like never really had this desire to kind of revisit it because I felt like I thought I remembered enough of it to remember that it wasn't that great. Now, this is where I'll echo a lot of what you said. Watching it now as an adult, I totally get where that reputation is coming from because you can't call it a good movie. But I'm kind of with you in that I do have to admit I still kind of loved this in a weird way.
Yeah.
Like it is like that's the thing is it's one of those movies you end up liking in spite of itself. And I would say a great comparison to those later Nightmare on Elm Street movies. If you can put aside the fact that Wes Craven seemingly entirely failed at what he was trying to do, because he's trying to make something different than like later Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but he's just making one. But then I have to realize I do like Nightmare on Elm Street 4. I'm a defender of Freddy's Dead, right? And those are like dumb movies, but I like them, and that's where this falls. This movie is so dumb at a certain point that it kind of comes back around to being entertaining. Because you're right, like the first 40 minutes or so are actually a really good Wes Craven movie, I think. Before you get to like anything supernatural, other than the dreams that Peter Berg is having that somehow connect him to Pinker. But beyond that, it just feels like this kind of dark serial killer story. Pinker's legitimately kind of scary in that section of the film. You're really kind of compelled by why is this guy having these dreams? What is this connection? And then once Pinker becomes like the electricity demon, which is really all I remembered, the movie goes off the rails in a way where I couldn't wait to talk to you, Chris, because I know your obsession with rules. And there was a point where I was watching the movie and I said, what I'm going to do on this episode is I'm going to offer Chris, I'll give you $100 American right now if you can explain to me the rules of this film, because nobody involved in the movie could. So I'm pretty sure you can't, because the movie just stops caring at a certain point. And I feel strange criticizing that, because I'm sure you and I have probably had this conversation before, Chris, in particular when I talk about how much I love Italian horror films of the 70s, and they're kind of known for this. And I do think horror is one of the genres where you really can play with the rules, because horror oftentimes can work on nightmare logic, and sometimes it even works better when you do that. There's a lot of classic horror films that kind of throw logic aside, but I think there's a difference between, and this is hard to quantify, I think there's a difference between throwing logic aside and throwing rules aside. I know it sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not, right? Because even in Nightmare on Elm Street, the final minutes of that movie, if you really sit down and think about it, with the whole thing with him disappearing into the bed and then the final dream, that's all pretty wonky on a logic level, right? But it's not necessarily breaking the rules that the film's established. It's just it's playing with logic, but it's like that movie's a nightmare, right? So it kind of works. This is the type of movie that shows how that's such a tough thing to get right, and how you can't just, because it's a horror movie, you can't just go, well, the rules don't matter, because here it really starts to get to you where you're like, wait, what? Why is this happening now? So we're both rambling in this, and that's what this movie does to you. But I agree that that's what's frustrating about the movie. That's what keeps it from being a movie that should have sparked a franchise or makes you want to see more. But at the same time, every time it does that, the one thing it has going for it is that it always is so dumb that I don't get angry at it. I laugh at it in an entertaining way. And that's why entirely throughout, I was entertained. And ultimately, I walked away from this going, actually, I wish I had revisited this more throughout my life, because I do enjoy this. This is a fun movie. That's all you can say about it.
Yeah, I'm going to quote Roger Ebert, one of our favorites. He said in his review with Siskel and Ebert, he gave it a thumbs down. but he said, if anything can happen, then you don't really care what happens.
Yes.
So I agree with that. Like, again, what Trev's saying, I'm Mr. Rules guy. Like, I mean, I think in every single episode we have a rules jingle that I throw in, and explain my grievances, right?
Yeah, and if you tried to use that this time, it would just be like half the episode.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not throwing it in this time. But I guess where I come down on it, because there's 50 rule breaks in the film, but the movie never tries to explain the rules either. Mm-hmm. Now, that is something that I do sometimes give a pass to a movie like this every once in a while, because they're not trying to, like what you're getting at the logic thing, right? When they start to logically explain things but then break them later, that's the biggest problem. Now, this movie just kind of throws shit at the wall.
Yeah.
And there's something like charming about that, right? Again, it does get a little frustrating. I'm not totally giving it a pass. But it becomes fun. Like you're saying, you're laughing at it. You're laughing that, he's jumping into different bodies, and then, he's jumping into TVs. Like there's a couple things here that, I felt it was a little bit of a missed opportunity with the concept. So Horace becomes, like you said, an electricity demon, right?
Here. Come on! Give it to me! You got it, baby.
The thing that I think detracts it the most from becoming a horror icon is that it becomes that body swap thing, right? Mm-hmm. You don't spend enough time with him. It's the same issue I have with Jason Goes to Hell. Mm-hmm. Jason just becomes every other character in the movie, and those actors are doing a take on Jason. Yeah. So you don't get to live with the villain that you came to see. So your big bad lacks specificity. It takes away from the iconography. And I didn't like how he started to use guns all of a sudden. He should have always been stabbing. Like always be stabbing, no matter who he's in the body of. Like, why does he change into? Again, why? This is going to be half the episode if I go down this rabbit hole. But I didn't like if you're going to make a body swap, make him true to Horace Pinker the entire time. Don't just become a cop and then start chasing around shooting a gun. You know what I mean? Find something to do the stabbing.
Now, to be fair, let us at least establish this, though. Shocker, much better than Jason Goes to Hell.
Oh, yeah. Way better. Jason Goes to Hell is horrible.
Yes, I would rather watch this 10 more times than deal with Jason Goes to Hell.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like that, the body swap thing can be done well. There are movies that have used that concept and are like. There's a great movie called The Hidden. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, Chris, with Kyle MacLachlan and Michael Nouri. That's like a movie with an alien slug that is jumping from body to body. Okay. So it's the same kind of idea, right? Where they're chasing this thing, but in that it's just like the host is a slug, right? Yeah. So kind of the part of it is like, okay, well, that's the concept, right? There was never an iconic villain already that you're now missing. And that's what happens when Jason or Horace disappears.
Yes.
There are times in this where the body swap thing pays off, and like the moment where he takes over the little girl is great. Yeah. Like that little girl is so there's a little girl that becomes possessed by Horace Pinker. That's like one of the highlights of the movie, honestly, because that girl just like really goes for it. She's very funny.
Come on, you fucker, move! Get away from my daughter! Go rip your lungs out, you son of a bitch!
But yeah, I agree that it sucks that he's not around more, and as you said, the point you made, which was so great, I'm glad you kind of verbalized it in a way that made sense to me, and that's what I was getting at, is that there's no point at the beginning of the film where you're told like what Horace Pinker is trying to do, or like once he does this ceremony in his jail cell that somehow summons this electricity demon that takes him over. It's not like then this character shows up and talks to Peter Berg and goes, well, don't you, I have this book here, and in his book he talks about this electricity demon. Totally. Now here's what you have to do. That never happens, right? Instead, every new revelation is one that it feels like they just like Craven came up with in the moment, right? And that's where they start to get like suddenly his dead girlfriend, Peter Berg's dead girlfriend, Cammie Cooper, that Horace murdered earlier, spoiler alert, she just shows up as a ghost at one point, and that comes out of nowhere, and you're like, wait, now this is a ghost movie too? And then she like gives Peter Berg this necklace that she was wearing and says, here, this necklace is what can like make Pinker have to leave the bodies he's in. And you're like, wait, what? Why? Like, where'd that come from? And how did the necklace actually appear in his hand if that was just a dream? So it just always feels like in the moment Craven's like, what about this now? And that even applies to like what Pinker is as a villain. So this is, I think, another problem with the Pinker character. And like you said, Pileggi is having fun, the character is fun, but every slasher needs their thing, right? Jason's thing is he wears a hockey mask and he kills campers or counselors in the forest. Michael Myers is he stalks like babysitters and people in this town, right? Freddy is he goes into your dreams and can stalk you. The problem with Pinker is that you walk away from this movie and go, oh, he's the guy that can move through electricity, but he's also the guy that can take over bodies. But then he's the guy that is specifically kind of tied to like TV channels. Like the movie never finds the central thing for him. He's too many things. And I think that is another detriment to the movie that probably confused people. And that's why the character didn't become as iconic as they were hoping for.
You know what I wish I wrote this down. I wish what he was from the outset. I again, the body swap thing is fun at a time, but I think he should have been like Electricity Gremlin. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
well,
like,
that's what I see. That's the thing. This is what I want to say. That's what I remembered this movie being, and obviously I was wrong. But that's like what my Mandela effect, memory of watching this as like a 10 or 11-year-old turned this movie into over the years. And you know why? Because the movie's called Shocker.
Totally.
And the cover is him in the electric chair getting electrocuted. So I was like, oh, that's the electricity power guy, right? And like, yeah, that's a way to put it, but not what we're saying.
But like how awesome would it be to see this movie? And again, me and you obviously really enjoyed this movie. But I think to make this the upper echelon franchise starter, to get sequels, how scary is it to learn that horrors can like just come out of outlets and shit? Out of car radios, traffic lights, getting onto the city grid and wreaking havoc. That should have been the start. That should have been, and maybe that's a budgetary thing. Like, I have no idea. This was 1989, so I'm not sure the logistics, but that is such a better concept than the body swap issue. Just make him so supernatural from the outset, and then, again, that's his thing. And it's just so much more interesting. Or even, I'd written down, too, before they actually started kind of doing this, but if you wanted to rip off Freddy a little bit more, why not? Because he's so in the electricity. He's so in the TVs and everything else. Why not when, Jonathan's watching Price is Right, okay? And all of a sudden, he's fallen asleep or whatever, and then he looks at the screen again, and then it's not Bob Barker anymore. It's Horace Pinker holding that big, long microphone and playing the game. And I know that's, like, leaning really into the Freddy stuff, but, like, we're already there anyways by that point in the movie. Just do stuff like that. Make him the sportscaster. Make him like the character in Leave It to Beaver, not just them running, side by side towards it. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's just more, it's more creative, it's more fun, but it's in contrast to that first half of the film, though, which is the first half of the film I think is its strongest. The first half is like you said, a legitimately great Wes Craven movie, and then it becomes goofy cartoon wham bam. So I know I'm asking for my cake and eating it too, but I mean that's sort of what this movie is, anyways.
Well, yeah, and you're totally right when you say that we're already in the Freddy territory, and that's what we were alluding to earlier when we said it's confusing to hear Craven say, well, I wasn't happy with what had happened in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I wanted to make this thing to kind of bury it and like kind of reinvent it. But then for no reason, he puts in so many Nightmare on Elm Street elements in this. I mean, the very beginning of this film is just a bunch of like, during the opening credits, it's a bunch of like close-ups of Horace Pinker working on a TV, right? Because he's a TV repairman. And you see him like tinkering with electronics and TVs. And it's so like, it looks like a replication, almost shot for shot, of the beginning of Nightmare on Elm Street where we see Freddy like making the glove, right? That kind of, that same thing. It has that like feel to it. And then, we go into this understanding. The movie's called Shocker. At this point, we've probably seen a trailer for it. We get that this is going to be an electricity thing. But as you said, the movie then also heavily plays on dreams and dreamscapes. And that's where you're really like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're Wes Craven. You're trying to do like a Nightmare on Elm Street competitor, but now you're already falling back into dreams, and like dreams are like a heavy part of this. Like that really kind of probably should have been left out. Like they should have found another way to have the Peter Berg character have this connection to Pinker, because the dream thing, you can't help but compare it to Freddy. And the problem is, as entertaining as Pileggi might be, as fun as Horace Pinker might be, you are now setting us up to compare to Nightmare on Elm Street, and sorry, this isn't going to win. This is not
Totally.
The comparison is never going to win out. Horace Pinker is no Freddy Krueger, as time and just this box office has proved. So don't put yourself in a position where we are contrasting the two. Just stick to the electricity thing.
We've talked about that in previous episodes about how these reboots or remakes. Obviously, this isn't a remake of Elm Street, but what you're getting at is stop reminding me. These remakes nowadays, or I mean throughout the last few decades, will remind you of what you loved before, and typically they're doing it worse. So it's just a reminder of something way, way better. So when Pinker is using the dreamscapes or like the dream walking stuff or the premonitions, and it's just so Elm Street that's all you're thinking about. And like you said, you're never ever gonna win. Horace Pinker will be annihilated by Freddy Krueger any day of the week.
And the movie feels like, and I don't know how much of this comes from perhaps edits after the fact. We said, as you said, it had to be cut down from X to R. I don't know if story stuff was lost in that element too. But the movie, there are at least some elements where it doesn't seem to commit to its own ideas or doesn't push far enough. So we've been, kind of dancing around and talking about how in the first section of this film, the really good section, there's this serial killer on the loose. He is murdering families all over town. That's Horace Pinker, but obviously the cops don't know that. They can't find this guy. And then Peter Berg's character, who is this young college football star who somehow has enough money to rent his own really nice house. I don't know. That was weird.
That was weird.
But he comes from a foster family. The foster father is a cop, and that family, the entire family except for the father, is murdered. But Peter Berg actually sees that happen first in a dream. He knows the family's been murdered before it happens, and then he continues to have dreams. He continues to have these dreams of the Horace Pinker murders before they happen. So he goes to his foster father, who at first doesn't believe him, but starts to see that there's some truth to this. Says, "I think I can help you catch this guy." What is ultimately strongly hinted at, but never confirmed, and that's what I'm getting at, is the idea that Horace Pinker is his actual father, that he was as a child, shot Horace Pinker because he was beating up him and his mom, and he just doesn't remember this, and that's like a buried memory for him. But now because of that the familial connection, that's why he's starting to have those dreams, which I guess is a kind of interesting idea. The problem is when Pinker brings that up to him, at the electric chair scene, and says like, "Don't you remember I'm your daddy?" They kind of insinuate that Pinker might be lying because he says like, "Well, Pinker heard you were a foster kid on TV." Like he probably just carried that whole story. And then the movie never bothers to say one way or the other. And that might seem like a little thing, but that's why the movie feels kind of sloppy, because you kind of get the sense that maybe Craven didn't know, maybe he didn't want to commit one way or the other. But I mean, you probably should give us these answers at a certain point.
That's right. I was beating you real good when your mama tried to stop me with that gun that she brought into our happy home. You saw me kill her. Don't you remember how she screamed? And how clever you were, grabbing that gun and shooting me right through the fucking knee, you little peckerhead!
Where did you come down on it?
I mean, I read it as he is his son.
Yeah,
I think
same.
that's the only way that the dream connection kind of makes sense to me. I just don't see why you wouldn't go for it and say it at some point, rather than why even raise the possibility that Pinker's just kind of messing with him.
Because I know in the very beginning of the movie, it's like 3 minutes in, it says like he was a foster child found when he was 7 years old, and immediately I wrote down in my notes, and he's like, he must be related to Horace. So
I think what's missing then though is, because Pinker says, like, "Don't you remember, I would beat up you and I'd beat up your mother and then you shot me," or whatever. At a certain point, he should finally have the flashback memory come back of that, right? That's what's missing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It never happens, right? He never suddenly goes, "Oh yeah, I do remember that." So I think he spends the whole movie wondering if that's the truth, but the movie should just commit one way or the other.
There's a lot of stuff that I think... Well, let's talk about Peter Berg for a second here. So Peter Berg as Jonathan Parker, I liked him in the movie. I think he's a strong lead. The issue though is that this guy goes through so much in this first, especially the first 40 minutes, that you kind of question how he's even functioning on a basic level, because Pinker kills his entire family, minus his foster dad. Kills his girlfriend brutally. Like that was very, very, very shocking. It's very humorless. It's extremely violent. I watched a it's violent off screen, but the aftermath is very violent and gruesome. And I actually watched an interview with Cammie Cooper about it, and she said that she had a ton of disagreements about that scene with Wes, especially for if she was going to be found in the bathtub of blood, naked or not. She's ultimately clothed in it, so she got her way because she sold it to Wes, being like, well, if I'm naked, then that has a whole other series of connotations to it as well. Yeah. And Wes ultimately agreed to it. So it was just an interesting... And then she goes off to talk about how these decisions are made at 2 a.m. where everybody's tired and everybody's just kind of fighting about what to handle the script or the set design. So it was just an interesting kind of on-the-fly decision, which goes actually back to what you were saying about all the rules and like shit, being thrown at the wall. It feels like a lot of this movie is that there are on-the-day decisions about what's going to happen next. Again... Allison is Cammie Cooper's character. Allison gets killed. Everybody in Jonathan's life seems to get killed. And he's still, like, going to... Not going to school, but he's still, like, again, able to function. I don't know. I found it was, like... there's so much trauma that's going on in that 40 minutes that when the quote-unquote reveal happens that I'm your daddy, it doesn't hit as well as I think it should, which you're so right.
The world is acting like that's what's expected of him. There's a really bizarre moment in the movie. Well, I mean, there's so many bizarre moments. And that's the thing, is this movie does have this strange level of detached reality, and that's kind of what ends up being funny about it.
Yeah.
But the morning after his foster family is brutally murdered, and he arrives at the crime scene, and his dad tells him he can't go in there, but he saw it all happen in his dream. The next morning he wakes up, and his girlfriend says, "Aren't you going to be late for football practice?" And all I'm thinking is, he could probably take practice off today, right? Like, I don't know if that's the most important thing. But then, like, that kind of like detached, human realism keeps popping up throughout the film, and like at some points it's like a benefit, like I said, at a camp level, because I do love later in the movie, once Pinker has come back as this electricity based ghost that's popping from body to body, when Jonathan goes and tells his football coach and his best friends, including Ted Raimi, they just instantly accept it, right? There's there's barely a moment of hesitation. They're like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, oh, okay. So we'll help you get this guy then. And it's like, well, wait, Chris, you're a great friend. You and I have known each other for many years. You came to me and told me that some murderer that you helped put away is now an electricity demon. I might doubt you for a while. I'd probably need to see some proof before my own eyes before I just was like gung ho and said, let's form a mob and I'll help you go get this supernatural being.
I kind of liked it though. Like, again, but I think it's
that's what I'm saying. I like
the camp aspect, right?
Yes, I like it because it's funny, but it's not. But the thing is, I like it because it's funny. But as you said, it makes that second half of the movie, you can't connect to it the same way you could in the first half.
No.
Because the first half really feels real and brutal and shocking, especially when the girlfriend goes. And then for the rest of the movie, it does become a cartoon. So it's kind of like this movie is like both what, Craven was trying to do with the original Nightmare on Elm Street and then what Nightmare on Elm Street became, all in one film, right?
Yeah.
Because it starts serious and actually scary, and then by the end you're just like throwing your hands up and saying, all right, this is just goofy. Like, I'm not taking this seriously. I can't if the characters are acting like this and they're just throwing new revelations at me. Like we said, I alluded to this earlier, but why is a necklace that he just gave his girlfriend as a present, why would that have any like power over Horace Pinker? It makes no sense, and it becomes like this crucial plot point. So I don't like whatever. The movie's not doing me any favors trying to figure this out. So I just will go along with it on a camp level.
Yeah. Like even that necklace gets thrown into the lake, and Jonathan decides to go get the necklace in the middle of the lake in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And
this is another one.
How is he gonna find it? Like, what's going on here?
Beyond that, another one of my favorite things is when he tells his friends, right, that he's like, the necklace got thrown in the lake. I need that to defeat Horace Pinker. but I can't go into the lake to get it without my diving mask. Right? He's like, can you please go to my house and get the diving mask? When his friends go to the house, guess what happens? Of course they get murdered by Horace Pinker, because you don't send your friends to the house that the killer's already been at, multiple times to say, go get my diving mask. What made me laugh out loud is once you finally see the diving mask that they went there to get and were murdered for, it's like a Dollar Tree diving mask.
Yeah.
He could have just got another one of those instead of sending his friends to the house where Horace Pinker was almost certainly waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the necklace appears anyway through the magic of angels. Yeah. And Allison just gets it back through his dreams anyways.
That whole sequence is so confusing.
Yes.
Because he sends his friends on this mission to take the power out in the city, because at this point Pinker has now attached himself to the power grid. And you're watching them do that in reality, and then you're cutting to Jonathan back at the lake going in to get the necklace, but then you realize that's like a dream sequence, but it takes a moment to figure that out, and then he wakes up from the dream sequence and still somehow has the necklace. Oh my God. That's where you're just like, what? Well, that even before that, I guess, but that's really one of the biggest stretches of logic and rules there.
And the set design is all over the place too. Sometimes his bed and house are completely covered in blood, and then 2 days later was totally cleaned up, and then he looks like he's moving out of the house, and then I guess not anymore, he's back living there. And I think this is the weird thing, because Wes Craven's obviously a master filmmaker, of course. He's made banger after banger, but this movie feels like it just feels so well put together, but then also totally one big cluster. Time, you don't get any sense of time. Even when you said about the next day after waking up after his parent or his family's murdered, it's was that the next day? When and then it cuts to the funeral. Okay, are we a couple weeks away from this now? Or there's no concept of time in this movie, and the set design's all over the place. The rules are being broken every which way. So there's nothing. It goes back to that Ebert quote, if anything can happen, then you don't really care what happens. And that is why this movie does not become the shocker franchise that it honestly should have been, because there's a lot of potential here. I like Horace Pinker. I like the idea of him being an electricity demon. I like the way he can show up to kill people. I like that he can go into the TV or kind of appear anywhere that there is electricity, or take over an electricity controlled armchair. Shit like that is fun. And I can see things later on in sequels that get just outrageous. He could become a toaster and shoot toast at somebody's head. It just goes right through the guy's eye. That stuff is all there. But I think this movie's there's so much shit being thrown at the wall. And it does come down to Wes Craven probably just being who the fuck cares? Who cares? And because there's no way, we talk about this a lot too. Why is it that nobody, it takes a ton of people to make a movie, right? And we're always why didn't anybody bring this up in the meetings? I absolutely think everybody brought this up at every single meeting with Wes, at every single morning meeting. And he was just fucking guys, who gives a shit? He's an electricity demon.
You have to imagine at some point someone involved, whether it be someone in the cast or a producer, especially once you said you get into that final half hour and we're getting the plan of the heroes enacted, that raises so many questions. Like you said, I can't imagine nobody was well, how does this work, Wes? Once you especially get into the climax of the film, and we'll get, and I have some things to say before that, but the climax of the film, which is, maybe on a creative level, one of the high points in terms of what it's trying to accomplish, but also one of the biggest head scratchers. Wes Craven had to answer for that to somebody, and I would have loved to hear what his answer was. And I'm kind of with you in thinking the only possible answer is, I don't know, whatever, right? There's just no answer that makes sense. There's no answer that can be tracked that I can see. I just wanted to go back to Peter Berg really quickly, not to belabor this point, but I think you and I have a slight disagreement here. I don't think Peter Berg is very good in this. I don't think Peter Berg was. I think there's a reason Peter Berg is more known today as a filmmaker than an actor, and why the acting career never came up. I just don't think he has an amazing screen presence. I think he's one of those actors who, and we don't like to shit talk actors. Let me be clear. We don't like doing that. But he is one of those actors, and I think it's true here, where I feel them acting.
Interesting.
To me, it feels like he's trying very hard to get to some of the emotions he needs to at points. and it's like he's concentrating on that, so he doesn't seem as natural as he could. I don't think he's not distractingly bad. He doesn't ruin the movie, but I'm not super into him. I do think Cammie Cooper is really good in this. I think she's quite likable, and I think you do feel really actually affected by her death. And when
she's also absolutely beautiful. Like,
she's beautiful, and when she comes back as the ghost, yeah, I think she is like. I'm not saying it's like she's not Meryl Streep in this or anything, but I'm saying for this type of movie, she's quite good. I do. We haven't mentioned him yet, but as grating as it's like meant to be, I like the performance of Michael Murphy as Jonathan's foster father, the cop, the lieutenant, who's just like always angry, but you get it. I mean, his whole family was just murdered.
Yeah.
And now he's like discovering that his foster son might have this like psychic connection to the murderer, and he's just so confused by that. Michael Murphy is one of those actors. If that name means nothing to you, folks, I'm not surprised, but just look up Michael Murphy and you'll go like, oh, he's one of those guys. He's like one of those ultimate like, oh, it's that guys. And I think he's pretty decent in this as well.
So I guess I don't know if I want to defend Peter Berg a little bit, but I really do like I like the hero villain dynamic in the movie, because he's very, better or worse, as what you're saying, is he's, maybe underselling it, but then Horace Pinker is just huge, right? So I think it kind of works in that aspect. Plus, I really did think it worked between him and Allison. She has just a genuine warmth to her. She's very soft spoken in the entire film. And it feels like, I don't know, they felt pretty natural to me. I think
any guy would probably be able to have some semblance of chemistry with Camille Cooper as Allison.
Okay, maybe you're right. Yeah, she's absolutely stunning.
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, all right, you're right. I wanted to bring this up real quick though. Did you like last episode we talked about the charms of filmmaking? Did you like all of the Steadicam shadows?
There is some shoddiness at times in this, that's for sure. Yes.
There's a lot of Steadicam shadows. Every like running scene, like especially in the football scene in the very beginning, there's obviously like a cameraman running with the actors, and you can just see the Steadicam. It's just, I don't know. I love seeing boom mics and Steadicam shadows. Those are my favorite.
Yeah. The other performance I actually do like in this is his coach. I think the coach is like a fun character when he's on screen. He's actually played by, as I was just looking this up, Sam Scarber, who was an American actor, but also a former American football fullback in the NFL for the San Diego Chargers. Okay. So that kind of explains why he's the coach in this. But his moment of like possession, but trying to fight off the possession, is like just the right level of cheesy, right? Like that scene works because he's going for it, and it's not entirely convincing, but it's like you can still feel the actor really trying, and it's not so silly you're laughing at it. You're getting the moment. So yeah, I like him in this as well. Yeah. Ted Raimi, I wish I could say more about him in this, but he's just there. But it's always nice to see Ted Raimi.
Yeah, I don't think he even has a line.
I think he has one line, maybe, if I remember correct, when he's like patching up Jonathan after like a play or something. But. Okay.
But yeah, no. Let's talk about that finale then.
Well, before we get to the finale, I do want to talk about the finale, but I do just want to say, because you brought it up, we would be remiss if we didn't say just a little bit more about the amazing the massage chair moment, where Horace Pinker becomes the massage chair, including the incredible line, "This Barca-lounger is going to kick your ass."
Yes.
Just a fantastic visual. The moment where the Barca-lounger actually starts to like eyeballs start to form in the back of it before Horace Pinker's head comes out. Just incredible. It really does look like he is getting attacked by the chair from Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Totally.
It's quite a moment.
So should we just jump into speaking of goofiness, I guess, let's talk about that finale. So I have a quote from Wes Craven here regarding the special effects. Because this is from the research on this, it felt like a lot of people's negative was from the special effects. I can agree to a point, because there's some charm to it, but it's definitely a squirrely production. I have a little quote here from Wes. "I'd like to redo Shocker just to get the special effects right, because we had a real special effects disaster on the film. The guy who was doing all the visual effects kind of flamed out had a nervous breakdown because he was attempting more than he could actually do. So it was kind of a race to the finish here in this epic finale of characters jumping in and out of TV programs and showing up during the Hindenburg explosion or on Leave It to Beaver or jumping out of sets into people's homes as they're watching things happen. That shit
Chris,
was so goofy.
In case anybody's confused by what you're saying, because why wouldn't they be? Maybe we should explain to anyone listening to this who's not watching the movie and is letting us walk them through it.
Okay, sure.
The big climax of this film is the plot that Jonathan eventually devises is because Pinker has now got into the electric grid, like we said. He's kind of bouncing around the city through the electric wires and everything. Jonathan devises a plan where he will get Horace Pinker to chase him into the TV. Now, why Jonathan is suddenly able to dive into the TV? Hey, your guess is as good as mine. But he says, I will get Horace Pinker to follow me into the TV. And then, yes, they end up in it's very much like that old John Ritter movie, Stay Tuned. They basically end up in the different channels. We see them like a montage of them going through different channels, interacting with Leave It to Beaver, going into a newscast with John Tesh, going to a boxing match, just everything, right? War footage.
Music videos.
Music videos, yes. But his ultimate plan is at the same time they're in the TV, he's going to get his friends to shut off all the power in the city. And his hope is that he can get out of the TV in time, but once the power is turned off, that will kill Horace Pinker. So I just wanted to set that up in case people were confused. Not that they're going to be any less confused now, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, so it's just a wacky, cartoony finale. Especially from the movie that started.
It feels like it should be a music video. Like, it feels like it should be a music video, right? Like, that whole sequence is a music video, essentially. You said they go into a music video, but just in general, I could see a music video, and I'm sure it exists, where people are just jumping through different TV programs.
Totally.
Right? That's what's happening. And that's where the Timothy Leary cameo happens. They jump into, a Christian evangelist television show. They're jumping into old sitcoms. But there's even moments where they come out of the TV and show up in people's homes, and even that is still cartoony. Like the family whose home they come out into and fight. I don't know if that was meant to be a reference to Roseanne from the time, because that's what it kind of looks like. But it's this kind of trailer park family, and they're not really reacting to this evil serial killer and this guy who just came out of their TV and are fighting. So it's just the movie at that point really does seem like it's trying to be over the top and funny. I don't know. It's really tough to figure out the movie's intentions at that point.
Well, it's hard to. Again, me and you are positive on the movie, but it's weird to tell people, hey, go watch Shocker, because in the beginning it's a devastating mass murder plot. And this horrible villain who's going around and killing people willy-nilly, and he might have a psychic connection to the main character. Oh, and by the end of it, they're jumping in and out of TV sitcoms, and it's one big Bugs Bunny cartoon.
Yeah. And again, I know you're not going to be able to answer this, Chris, but I'm going to pose the question anyways and see if you can try to answer it. I'm going to make you speak for this movie, Chris. Sorry.
Oh, no. Okay.
Why is it that Jonathan can take the remote control into the TV world with him and use the remote control to control Horace Pinker? And a two-part question. So that's the first part of it. Second part is, if you do accept that he can use the remote control, I understand when he hits pause and it makes Horace Pinker pause. I get that. But then what is he hitting on the remote to make Horace Pinker bounce all around the room and punch himself? What are the buttons on the remote that does that?
Well, first off, if Horace can jump in other people's bodies, why doesn't he just jump into Jonathan's body?
Hey, shut up.
Okay. Regarding the remote control, I have thought about it for the last 3 days since I watched the movie. And no idea, other than maybe the Force, why he doesn't use rewind and fast forward or turning off either. That would probably be, or be one of those, the classic Austin Powers, switch him to Espanol. That'd be fun. But yeah, it's probably the dumbest part. So when and especially because Jonathan has like this monologue as he's doing it. He's like, "You're not going to control me, and you've killed my family, and we're going to put an end to this." And it's like very dramatic. It's like a dramatic moment, but it looks so dumb. Like it just looks silly.
But this is what I mean about my relationship with Shocker now and how I feel about it. And I don't know if you'll go with me on this, but you're absolutely right. It's the dumbest part, but also kind of the most awesome part, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what I mean. Like it's so stupid that at that point you're just like, this is great. Like because I don't care anymore by that point. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that the movie has lost its semblance of reality so hard at that point that you just have to go along with it.
Yeah.
And you are laughing. I don't know if you're laughing with it, but you're definitely laughing at it. And yeah, that climax is ridiculous. It's nonsense. It makes no sense. But I can't say I wasn't amused and entertained by the entire thing.
This is a movie where you absolutely 100% have to turn your brain off.
Oh,
and that is not a negative. That is not a bad thing to say. It is one thing you just, like you're saying, just go with it, have a good time. I just wish to make this like a truly memorable, amazing horror film. I just preferred the first half. You know, like I like the second half for its dumb charm, its silliness, its goofiness, but I prefer that first half because that was genuinely frightening and exciting to me.
Yeah, no, that's where I agree. Like that's ultimately the detriment to this film is that there is a legitimately scary, more chilling, effective version of Shocker in here, buried in here. There's a version of Shocker that was actually, just about this, this serial killer who somehow makes this deal with a demon and somehow taps electricity powers, but the movie never goes over the top with it and sticks to it. And then we don't get to, the climax of this movie until Shocker 3 or 4,
Yeah.
That the series goes, okay, now we can have more fun with Horace Pinker. This movie tries to have it all. This movie tries to kind of cover an entire franchise in one movie. And that ends up having some whiplash to it. And that's what, and you said maybe the movie's a little overly long. It doesn't seem to find a consistent tone. You do find yourself asking tons of questions. I mean, I can't imagine anyone watching this movie and not constantly going, huh? What?
Yeah.
Why is it when he jumps into the bodies, why do they have his limp? Their bodies should be fine, right? Like a limp's not a thing that should go. I get the personality, but why is his limp inherited by each body? I get the answer so we know it's him, but come on,
Yeah.
So
why does Angel Allison shoot super light into
yes
into the evil soul of Pinker?
Yeah. So the questions like that abound. But you're right that there is a scarier version of this. I do wish that version existed, and we can talk in a little bit about how there are at least there are some people on record saying they would have liked to have revisited this movie as a remake or whatever. But if you just put that aside and say, okay, unfortunately we didn't get the potential of what this movie could have been, if you can enjoy it for what it is quite the good time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The cast seems to speak favorably on it. They all had a really good time with Wes. Apparently Wes was I know you talked about him being an intellectual, but apparently he was quite a funny guy. And
you've never heard, nobody seems to have ever had a bad time working with Wes Craven.
No. So I watched, like I said, a couple of interviews with Mitch Pileggi and then Cammie Cooper, and they both were just over the moon working with him. Mitch has said that he would like to see a reboot happen or a remake. All he asks is if he can just be like a background actor or just even a guy walking across the screen. He goes, my body can't take it to redo that character anymore, but just throw me a cameo. That's all he's wondering, but he would love to see it in new hands. I know Wes was on, what I mentioned with the VFX quote. He wanted to remake this, especially when, all the remakes of his franchises were happening. He was talking about like, oh, you know what? Shocker would be one that we should revisit. And then unfortunately he passed away. And it does sound like all talks of a Shocker reboot or remake kind of ended when he was gone. So
there is a part of me that's actually very surprised we never got a Shocker remake, especially during that onslaught of horror remakes when it seemed like every property possible was being snatched up and remade. But I guess ultimately that is the biggest proof of the lack of sustained impact this movie had, is that even at that time when we were getting Prom Night, Black Xmas, When a Stranger Calls. Everything was getting snagged up and remade. And nobody was like, let's do Shocker now.
Totally.
But I kind of do think that's too bad, because I'm with Wes Craven in that watching this and still having a good time. I would say, and Chris, I'll ask if you agree, I do think this movie's due for a remake. I think this is a concept that should be revisited, actually, and I think we need to find a new Horace Pinker. I would keep that character. I do love the idea of Mitch Pileggi having a cameo. I actually think it'd be really fun. I'm sure there are rights things that would get in the way of this, but what I think would be great is if you do another TV sequence, if you could have a scene with Mitch Pileggi as Skinner from X-Files and have the new Horace Pinker kind of interact with that. But whatever the case, I would like to see this actually kind of resurrected today.
Same. I think the concept's great. I think this is a fun, interesting, unique horror movie monster.
Yeah.
And I would love to see more. I definitely keep one tone per movie, though. I would like to, if you're gonna go crazy from the start. That's totally fine with me. But I would like to maybe see a slow ramp up, just kind of the way all these remakes or all these horror franchises do, right? Like they start out really deathly serious, and then all of a sudden we go off the rails and we end up in space. So, I'm down for that.
Well, I'm not opposed to Horace Pinker in space, though. Imagine all the hijinks he could get up to on the space station.
Crossover with Star Trek. Trev's Star Trek Minute starts right now.
I was trying, but I didn't see anything worth nothing crucial enough to mention. Chris, I'm curious, really quick.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite Horace Pinker one-liner? Because I'll just tell you mine. There's a great moment where he picks up Jonathan and he starts to electrocute him, and he says, "Do you want to take a ride in my Volkswagen?" I thought that was a good one.
That was a good one. I also liked when he bit off the fingers of a security guard, and he goes, "Finger licking good." Yeah. I like that too. We've mentioned where kind of some of these actors have gone off to. Mitch Pileggi, went off to the X-Files, and he's kind of one of those guys that is always working. Peter Berg,
you see him pop up on TV all the time.
All the time. Peter Berg went off to be one of Hollywood's biggest directors. Loves Mark Wahlberg. And then we never mentioned Cammie Cooper, but I wanted to mention that she stopped making movies just a couple movies after this one by her own choice. She just was never really fulfilled with the industry. She was never truly happy in the sense of always. In her interview that I saw of her, she goes, I didn't want to be focused on my looks or my weight every single day, and it was going to have a negative mental health effect on me, and it wasn't for me. And her husband actually started a production company, and then she just was very unhappy, and she left the industry altogether and decided to go devote her life to helping children of sexual abuse. So she actually went on to do some good in the world versus just make pretend. Make pretend is all great, and I love it, but it was nice to see a story that this beautiful woman that was in, or the beautiful young woman that was in this movie didn't get chewed up and spit out by the industry. She left on her own accord to do something good.
There's a few actresses like that for me, where you're always a little sad when an actress you like is only in a couple things and then left the industry. But at the same time, it's always nice to hear that story of because Hollywood is a shit show. And when you hear that some of them got out while the getting was good, and don't seem bitter and don't seem negative about it, like you said, is still willing to sit down and do a fun interview about Shocker and look back on what they did with amusement, but have moved on to a more normal life. That always makes me happy that they were able to get out before the industry caused irreparable harm to them.
Totally.
So yeah, good for her. Good for her for doing that. And I don't know if she's listening, but if she is, Cammie, I hopefully you're still willing to do a cameo in the Shocker remake. Chris and I are going to get going too, but keep up the good work.
Yeah, 100%. So that really brings us to the end of Fall Back to the 80s. This has been super fun. Just to reiterate the ones we did Flash Gordon, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, Streets of Fire, Remo Williams, Masters of the Universe, and now Shocker. And Trev had texted me right before we did the podcast, and he goes, "We should rank them." So let's do it. What's your favorite? Let's go with you first. Your favorite to your least favorite, and then I'll do mine.
All right, so my favorite, I don't think there's no question here. I don't think anybody will be surprised. My favorite of the bunch was Streets of Fire. I think that is the one that I would say, anybody listening to this, if you haven't seen Streets of Fire, make it a point to do so. I promise you're going to be entertained by it. No one I've shown it to has ever not liked it, and I almost can guarantee it'll become a favorite of yours. Chris, I'm sorry. I hate to do this to you.
I knew it. I knew it'd be here.
My number 2 is The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. I just still, I understand your problems with it. I will never be confused by anyone who doesn't like it, but it's just unbridled creativity, ambition, and weirdness speaks to me. That's my number 2. Sure. My number 3 is Shocker. I think Shocker is, like I said, I actually wish I'd spent more time the last couple decades revisiting it, and now I think I'll make a point to. If I've already been looking, can I get my hands on that like Scream Factory Blu-ray? Because it's really dumb, doesn't make sense, nothing adds up, but it's a good time. It's a very fun watch if you know what you're getting into. This is where the last 3 are pretty shaky for. It was tough for me. I couldn't really figure out. So what I ultimately fell on is my number 4. I'm going to give to Remo Williams. The Adventure Begins. I have that DVD, so I gotta somehow justify that. But as I said at the time, I actually legit like the first half of Remo Williams. I just wish the second half didn't exist. Next for me is Masters of the Universe. I don't know how often I'd revisit Masters of the Universe, but it's enjoyable enough on like a certain camp level. And I think it's ultimately more successful at, doing what it's trying to do and being a fun, goofy fantasy movie than what comes in dead last for me, which is Flash Gordon. A movie I will just, we said this before, I'll never understand the people who are so into Flash Gordon. It's got a couple good scenes, but ultimately it's way too much of a slog. So that's my ranking.
This is what I love about this podcast, and listeners, if you're new here, go back and listen to all these other episodes, because our lists here are like really totally different. And that's what's so fun, is that we can have these discussions if we fight to the bitter end, or if we're in pretty much a total agreement on Shocker. It's just it's a fun. They've always been fun conversations, and there's reasons why they're so different. But I guess my list, obviously, number 1, Streets of Fire. I absolutely adored it. It's so close to being perfect. There's some things that are missing in it still, just to keep it from my most coveted 4-star rating. But I've been actually on the lookout for the Blu-ray. It's just oh my god, it's like $60. I don't know if I love it that much. But Streets of Fire number 1. Number 2 is Shocker. I
cool.
quite like this one. I will be telling friends about this one, especially when they're looking for something to watch on Halloween. Next is Masters of the Universe. I thought that was fun. I liked it. It was kind of that silly old school 80s fantasy junk, and I found it charming. Next, so the next 3, the last 3 are squirrely. Like, they are basically interchangeable. I'll say it like that. But I put Flash Gordon next, mostly because of its iconography. Mostly because of the 3 scenes that everybody remembers is more than the other 2 for me. And the score is kind of cool too, by Queen. And then Remo Williams is next. This I thought was okay, but there were some big problems in it that is hard. Yeah. It's hard for me to recommend this ever to anybody. Go listen to that episode. We have quite an interesting conversation on that. And then, Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai comes in last for me. I apologize to you the same way you're apologizing to me. But this one, it just did not click for me. And that's okay. That seems like that's that kind of movie. Buckaroo Banzai is either you have it on the top of your list or the bottom. There is no in between. So
that's true.
Yeah, which is kind of cool. So this has been great. Fall back to the 80s was an awesome event for us. It was super fun. All these were first-time watches for me, so I had a blast. Moving in, Trev, it's been a while, but I love the themes, and we haven't been able to announce a new theme month for a while because this was a 3-month thing. Holy shit.
We've been stuck in the 80s forever here.
We're stuck in the 80s. Well, we are flash forwarding to the 2000s because
Flash Gordoning?
I heard it when I said it. But we are heading into the month of November.
Oh my God.
We're looking at 2 Vin Diesel films. The Pacifier from 2005 and then The Last Witch Hunter from 2015. So, yeah, November is on its way.
So gather your family and make sure to listen to those.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to putting those ones together editing-wise. There's a lot to... Vin Diesel might be a crazy person. I don't know if you know this.
Vin Diesel is... Whatever you think of the man, there's no doubt he's a fascinating figure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Did you ever see his video of him dancing to his webcam?
I've seen that, and I've also seen a favorite of mine is the old commercial with him pimping the Street Sharks toy line.
Oh, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Have you also seen him sing to a projection that's behind him?
I don't know if I've seen that.
Oh, well, guess what? All 3 of those things are probably going to go in our episodes, so you can listen to them. So yes, keep on with us at F2F Pod. That's at F2 the number 2 F Pod on all the socials. Like us there, like us everywhere. Then rate, review, whatever you do. A star rating would be awesome. And then just join the tribe, hit that subscribe, because we are going into November with a vengeance, I guess.
Yeah.
With a vengeance.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Looking forward to it. And hey, who knows? Keep an eye on those podcast feeds, and maybe there'll be a little extra surprise for you before November. So, just saying. Maybe there'll be a special bonus Halloween surprise.
Beautiful. We love our fans, don't we?
We do. We're so nice to you. So, please. We watched all these 80s movies for you, and we liked a couple of them.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
I got a buddy of mine listened to the Masters of the Universe one and decided he's going to watch it. So, interesting.
Okay. That's his funeral, but...